Okay, good morning and welcome from me too. I have the great pleasure of welcoming and introducing two excellent keynote speakers to our morning panel and to chair this morning plenary. The first speaker today is June Borras, of who many of you, I'm sure, have already heard. Just want to give a very brief introduction. June is professor of agrarian studies at the International Institute of Social Studies in The Hague and a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam. The emphasis of his work has been, and still is very strongly, on bridging academic research, policy practice, and social movement activism. He used to be a part of the international peasant and farmers movement, La Via Campesina, during the earlier years of its formation. He continues to engage with various progressive transnational agrarian, environmental, and food sovereignty movements. He is currently the editor-in-chief of the Journal of Peasant Studies. He has also helped in initiating and forming international networks which engage researchers on a number of themes, including initiatives in critical agrarian studies and land deal politics initiatives. He further coordinates research projects which bring together academic researchers and grassroots activists. While giving a full list of June's achievements and his work would certainly take up too much time, I rather want to give the floor to you, June, to talk about land politics, agrarian movements, and scholar activism. Please all welcome June Borras.
All right. Very honored to be here and very happy to see Helsinki in mid-February. Not too scary, I found out. Good. The title is slightly changed, and I would be focusing more on natural resource politics and struggles for deep social reforms, and then ending up with a short discussion on what do we do as engaged researchers. Okay, just checking on my time. It's scary to see the position of your timing here, so I have to strive to be closer to that. Converging multiple crises in recent times during the past decade or two decades. It resulted, among other things, in the multiple commodity booms, rushes. And then it resulted about 10 years ago in this explosion of land grabs, as the media have come to label them. The idea is very, at its peak, various reports would point to the fact that up to about 250 million hectares of land have been implicated to the global land rush in terms of involvement of corporations. But probably the scale of that is bigger if we talk about those done in stealth, not involving corporations, but individuals and other different layers of land brokers. So it's huge. The idea is very simple. The whole thing is that with all the different crises that the world is facing, there's a solution to it. And the solution lies, this is the mainstream narrative, lies in the existence of marginal, empty, underutilized, and available lands worldwide. And some extrapolation of some satellite data would put that up to about 1.5 billion hectares of land. What it means is that the mainstream narrative would like us to believe that we can double the quantity of actually cultivated lands without expelling people from the land, because these lands are assumed to be empty and available. Are they? Well, we already know that the conflict around this land reallocation shows that, well, they're not really empty. And who gets to define what is available or not is a political issue. So we start from that kind of thing. That whole scramble for natural resources coincided with or exacerbated or partly causing a global crisis that especially affected the world's countryside. When we talk about cities, the world, like about 10 years ago, made a strategic shift. It's more people now live and work in the cities. But what that means up to today is still, in absolute terms, we are talking about more than 3 billion people still rural. And that's still a lot of people. And that any issues pertaining to the cities cannot be completely divorced from what happens in the countryside. So that makes the countryside remains a very important space to understand. Well, what happens is that we saw the countryside with expulsions, dispossessions, jobless economic growth, polarization in wealth and resource access, collapse of public infrastructure, collapse of public health, social decay, including drug addiction, and so many everyday issues confronting people in the countryside, plus climate crisis and responses to the climate crisis that directly impact people in the countryside. I couldn't decide whether to go here. Let's go down here. There are many mainstream responses to agrarian crisis and climate crisis, and I would not go to all of this, but I would focus on some of the things, a few things. One is climate-smart agriculture. Climate-smart agriculture, I'm putting it here in a prominent spotlight, not because it's bigger than REDD Plus or other inventions in recent time in terms of responses to environmental and climate crisis, but because the idea of climate-smart agriculture, despite its being a very small kind of funded initiative at the moment, actually the mainstream ideas on how to deal with and how to understand and deal with the issue of a climate crisis and agrarian crisis is crystallized in that idea. The 3 pillars of climate-smart agriculture is based on increased productivity, increased resilience, and reduced emissions. Very catchy kind of things. You see 750-page kind of manual of FAO and the World Bank. Fascinating kind of stuff. But then you see the silences, there's no mention of redistribution, no mention of justice and everything. What's going on? But it's the very mainstream neoliberal response to the problems created by neoliberalism in the first place. So it's a market solution to the problems created by markets kind of thing. So it's the importance of CSA is more about in its ideas and not about the project of CSA. But also the implicit assumptions that underpins these kinds of thinking is very important for us to understand when we talk about sustainability and justice and politics. The idea behind is standing on the twin pillars of the assumption that the current and the current traditional way of production and reproduction in many agrarian societies today are either economically inefficient or ecologically destructive, or worse, both. And something has to be done with that. And the target, there are specific target communities in that. Shifting cultivation upland communities, which remains quite substantial number of people in those communities today. Pastoralist communities, artisanal fishing communities, among others. So, and everyone, of course, is jumping into this whole idea of increased productivity, resilience, reduced emissions as the guiding principles on how to deal with our climate crisis now. So we see a lot of funding going on in billions, not just for NGOs, but also for academic scientific research, the theme of which is narrowly pitched on how to make CSA work. So here's $1 billion, do some research on these things. So even knowledge production, the politics of it, it's not politically innocent. The way these things are being framed and the way people are pushed into transmission belt of knowledge generation, they're all politically charged. The other thing is, well, I'm going back and forth on land grabs and climate change politics. And I'm looking at, I've been doing quite some research on the intersection between natural resource-based, much of the climate change politics, mitigation, adaptation, have something to do with natural resources. Not all, but quite a bit of that. And it's oscillating between rhetoric and reality. But even rhetorics about climate change politics are reality. Rhetorics have a very real impact on everyday lives of people. And then the ongoing land grabs. What we see is overlapping, intersecting, parallel, mutually reinforcing processes of climate change politics on the one side. That includes generic big conservation. Shen's work is very much on the spot on that kind of thing. And resource grabs. And by resource grabs, I meant to include not just the big corporate kind of grabs with big iconic logo of big corporations and big tractors, but also, and most especially, stealth resource grabs. Grabs that are far more pervasive, in my view, but much more understudied and understood, more entrenched and intractable. They attracted the whole land rush, attracted a lot of land speculators, brokers, swindlers, scammers, thieves, money launderers. There are individuals, paramilitary, militia, narco syndicates, all sorts of lumpen elements. They are very much below the radar, invisible, but they were routinized. And that routinization, normalization of these processes invisibilized many of these politics of reallocation of control of resources, while the spotlight is being very much into the big corporate land deals, which is important, but it doesn't represent the totality of what's happening in the world today. When we fuse them together, we see the enormity of what's going on. When we see the implication of climate change politics on natural resources, then we see even a bigger thing going on. The connection between the two occurs in at least four broad ways, where climate change mitigation politics, trigger, one, they constitute land grabs themselves. Two, they trigger for land grabbing. They are triggers for land grabbing. Three, they are legitimating process for land grabs. Fourth, they are the legitimating processes for actually existing people's community traditional mitigation adaptation practices. There are so many mitigating practices, but because they are not officially labeled as such, then they can be bulldozed because they are not considered as mitigation processes because they are not formally and officially labeled as such. And lastly, these processes stoke and provoke old and new conflict. The estimate is that if we combine, as I already said, all these things, the affected, the implicated natural resources and people in it are quite extensive. Two, the logic of the intertwining of the two processes shows a far more problematic situation. Land grabs can actually undermine even well-intentioned and real climate change mitigation and adaptation, while the latter can constitute, trigger, legitimize, or reinforce the former. Third, the challenge of tackling global land grabs from a social justice perspective, a sense of justice for people, not just a sense of justice for our ecology, necessarily brings a similarly social justice perspective on climate change mitigation and adaptation and vice versa. And it has become crucially important to extricate the study and practice of natural resource-oriented climate change politics from its currently too narrow, although very popular, framing of largely project-oriented initiatives. It trivializes the enormity and intensity of the actual problems of climate crisis and environmental and agrarian crisis towards a broader and deeper system and society-wide perspective. In all these things and seeing all the other problems in the countryside of the world, the general outcomes that we see include reconcentration of wealth and the means of production to produce wealth, land, water, forests, seas, others. Two, the threat to existing access to commons, access to all these means of production. Third, it globalized and made much more multi-sectoral dispossession, including expulsions from land, rural, but also urban, global south, but also global north. The land question confronts no longer just people in the countryside of the global south working on farming. It's way much more kind of universalized and globalized today. And also the inability to regenerate or to respond to climate change in a truly social justice kind of framework. All this, and to complicate our discussion about policy processes and politics, is the fact that we cannot ignore that there is this, there is a massive and truly global right-wing populist upsurge. We can always talk about research and the policy processes and our theory of change that are important to have. But the fact is that the world has been transformed very recently, and the world has seen this worldwide phenomenon of right-wing populist upsurge and they do things very differently. Many of them are anti-science, climate change deniers, and so on and so forth. It's a critical political context that is so widespread today, currently, that it renders our usual way of working, doing our research and policy advocacy, sectoral issues on agrarian or environmental or food politics increasingly difficult, the way we do it. We need to embed our analysis and politics within this broader political realities. This is the elephant in the room, and we need to just confront them on the one hand, but also on the other side, it's been too long. The third way, the dominance of the third way approach, the dominance of the consensus at the center. This is partly part of the reason of the right-wing resurgence, which is the consensus at the center tells us that the way forward to confront problems is to do win-win options, conflict-free resolution of class conflicts, multi-stakeholderism, and everything, which is fine. But it also made a lot of those excluded and oppressed feel that they have no space in resolving properly in a justice framework their issues. And in many cases, this consensus at the center actually formalized expulsions, dispossession, exclusion, marginalization. They routinized and normalized, and thereby also invisibilized in many occasions injustices in the world today. But then suddenly you have this right-wing populist resurgence. And the relationship between right-wing populism and the countryside is yet to be understood in the current context. We cannot assume a straightforward kind of relationship. Modi and the rural India, Trump and rural America, Marine Le Pen and the French countryside, Thaksin and northeastern Thailand, and so on and so forth. Putin and the Russian countryside. We need to understand better the connection of why so many people actually are gambling on this very problematic right-wing populism. And especially because historically, there is this troubling relationship between, for example, fascism in the past and their social base in the countryside. Mussolini and Hitler at first gathered their mass support from the countryside. We need to understand better because we are being confronted now by this kind of phenomenon. In short, we have the usual problems in terms of inequality in and lack of access to means of production to make decent living in the countryside, how to do social justice frame conservation, regeneration, police work, etc. The only difference is that this time is much bigger, more complex, and rural people are tired of cycles of unmet demands and broken promises in the past, and they are willing to gamble on new ways of addressing these concerns. It complicates a lot of the way we think about policies and politics. In terms of research, what the above implies is that is the fundamental relevance and at the same time limits of class politics and class analysis. Populism in its nature cuts across, validates, but at the same time cuts across classes and class politics. And thus, the need to reaffirm class on the one hand, and at the same time go beyond class purism in the study of agrarian political economy and agrarian politics. What is to be done? Ask big and act insurgent. The point of the urgency and necessity of deep social reforms. The problems are huge. When we say the problems is land grabs, the usual mainstream consensus at the center kind of response is that, well, the problem is land grabs, the solution is to how to make the processes more transparent and more consultative, as if transparent and consultative land grabs are different from non-transparent land grabs. They're both land grabs, and people are tired of that kind of solution, and they're seeking other ways of resolving problems in their midst, in the everyday life. Here I would propose just run down 5 interlinked deep social reforms that have been made much more urgent and necessary in the current context. Redistribution. In situations where a few cornered so much of created wealth and the means to produce it, land, water, forests, seas, minerals, finance, technology, knowledge, framed powerfully by the slogan, the 1% versus the 99%, for instance, in the Occupy Wall Street episode. A mass of people without decent jobs means to construct livelihoods. Political struggles for redistribution becomes central. Well, again, it has always been central before. But somehow, during neoliberalism, no one wants to talk about redistribution. Redistribution. In the countryside today, it can mean redistributive land policies. And here I would like to summon back a conventional kind of idea of the twin pillar of land size ceiling and minimum access, which means there has to be a limit to how much individuals and corporations can accumulate in terms of natural resources. There has to be a cap in that. At the same time, there has to be a minimum floor, a minimum access to people who would like to make their living by having access to those natural resources. They cannot be separated, the minimum and the ceiling. Without which, no amount of policies regarding natural resources, no amount of policies and initiatives on conservation, regeneration will work. The logic of capital will always accumulate more control of resources for further expanded capital accumulation. Second, recognition, where ordinary people still have access to resources, but that access is threatened by multiple processes based on class, race, ethnicity, gender, generation. The political struggles for recognition of these rights become urgent and necessary. In agrarian societies, it can mean land and territorial claims of indigenous peoples' communities, distinct rights of women and youth over natural resources, and so on. Third, restitution. In settings marked by widespread dispossession, whether access to natural resources or healthcare, pensions, social services, political struggles for restitution becomes central and urgent. In the countryside, this can mean land restitution, restitution of access to water, restitution of resources damaged by tailings of minings, by all sorts of impunity of corporations and central states. Regeneration or conservation. Regeneration in the era of climate change, climate crisis, and neoliberal responses to it, as I mentioned earlier, market-based solutions to problems created by markets. Political struggles for social justice framework or climate justice become urgent and necessary. In the countryside, this can mean fusing the principles of agrarian justice, we call the ceiling and the floor principle, and climate justice, and rejecting purely market-based transactions cast as solutions, carbon trading, and so on and so forth. Finally, resistance. Class and identity politics. It's logically antagonistic, the whole kind of conflict. It has class and identity dimensions to it. And it's completely unavoidable to pretend that it could be avoided and evaded, as what the consensus at the center would like us to believe is to basically fan the flames of right-wing populism as a way to resolve those conflicts. But we also do not deal with homogeneous mass of people populating a riverbank or a forest or village rolling hills. They are all socially differentiated, and we talk about justice. It's unthinkable not to talk about class or identity politics. But the class of poor, oppressed working people, being class conscious is key in any talks about resistance. The consensus at the center would always like us to talk about representation without resistance. Multi-stakeholderism is being like kind of that is the mantra. That's the only way to resolve conflict. As if, everyone has to have the right to be around at the table, and everyone, as if, has the same degree of power of sitting around the table. It didn't work, it is not working, and it's not gonna work, at least in resolving conflict in the interest of advancing social justice solutions to our problems. It might work in facilitating smoother corporate capital accumulation processes, but if our interest is on advancing justice, it won't work. We need much more kind of a different framing of resistance. Resistance with representation, which is much more kind of a pragmatic way of doing kind of militant work. The 5 R's, the 5 deep social reforms that I'm talking about, it's not a checklist that, check, we are interested only on the first and second R, but not really on the third, fourth, and the fifth. We're interested only on the first and the third R, but not really on the rest. But it doesn't work that way. In many societies, it's so intricately intertwined kind of issues that those 5 are actually inseparable. The challenge for us is to develop struggle fronts around ways of actually responding to the logic of the intertwining of problems. Regeneration by restitution, for instance. In places where I work a lot these days, like Cambodia and Myanmar, when you talk about, Myanmar has about 1 million indigenous, internally displaced people. But when you talk about a village, for instance, probably the current occupant there, if you do something like, okay, let's have an in situ, on-site land mapping, which is a very important, harmless kind of way to go, so that to protect the rights of the villagers. So we do, and we support a lot of money, and we do a lot of research on that, not knowing that actually, out there in the boundary in Thailand, there were those people who were the original occupants of that village that were like 10 years ago were militarized and were hamleted, and so they fled. But they still wanted to claim through restitution that kind of idea. But many of those 1 million IDPs in Myanmar now are losing some of their original lands that they wanted to claim to conservation initiatives. So big conservation organizations are coming in the name of climate change, and then they are cordoning off. And they said, well, there's really not many people here. But yes, because they were expelled 10 years ago and they wanted to come back. Anyway, it's more of looking at the logic of the interconnection and trying to see much more interconnected ways of looking at things. So regeneration by restitution, regeneration by redistribution, or redistribution with regeneration. Land reforms in the past is a very economistic way of approaching land and land resources. It's not gonna fly in the current context too. Land reform just measuring the success of that in terms of economic terms of farm size and productivity in the old days of the discussion of, or terms of trade between the town and country. The world has changed. Redistribution without regeneration is unthinkable too. So we need to think more along these lines. And the key challenge is to see how broad united front among desperate enclaves of social justice frame, but sectoral struggles can be forged. It's difficult, but not impossible. The deep social reforms. Sometimes we stay away from big issues because it's not doable. So we go into what is doable. But as we see, people are sick and tired of that. because it doesn't really change much their situation. But we should always remember too that many of the rights and freedoms that we enjoy today, 8-hour working, minimum working day, voting rights, the formal end of South African apartheid, and so many other deep social reforms that now we enjoy today, and sometimes we take for granted, were outcomes of fierce, relentless, and ardent political struggles, much of which are class politics, taking the side of the oppressed in the past. None of which were achieved because the labor aristocrats had a nice meeting with the corporate owners in a nice office. Much of which were achieved because of mass strike of workers. It's a class conflict and struggles. So the problem today is even bigger. And so why would we expect to resolve those problems in a much kind of lower level of conflict and struggle? And so the urgency and importance of these deep social reforms and the way they struggle for it. Okay, I'm just rushing now. Wrapping up. Reclaiming populism. This is the proposition. What to do? Well, reclaiming populism towards a reformulated notion of left-wing populism. It's more, put it in a provocative way. Provocative way because we have seen some left-wing populism, but it's also very problematic. So that's why my point of a reformulated notion of left-wing populism. Populism, simply defined as aggregating disparate and different, sometimes competing class and social groups' interests into a singular voice, the people's voice. That's populism. Now, it's not inherent in populism to be right-wing or left-wing, you know, in that kind of sense. Ernesto Laclau would say that it's to us whether a group is populist or not is to ask the wrong question. Because when you talk about politics, essentially all politics entail and imply a degree of populist action when you aggregate disparate voices and interests in that sense. But we are confronted by a particular and much more dominant type of populism today, which is the right-wing brand of populism that affirms basically a market solution anyway in their own way, but it's also vicious. It's xenophobic, racist, misogynistic, climate change denial, and so on and so forth. On the other side, in my field, in agrarian studies, populism is a bad word. We have the term agrarian populism, which the history of that is basically just across very near here now in Russia. Well, it started in 1898 upon the formation of the Russian Social Democratic Party by Lenin, when Lenin declared that some of the problematic elements in the Russian politics at the time were right-wing, but they were populist, but they were referring to the right-wing brands of populist, not the original left-wing People's Will or Narodnaya Volia, which are largely Marxist and left-wing populists anyway. But more than 100 years of Marxist agrarian studies and actual politics, agrarian populism acquired a very negative, pejorative meaning, which means class-blind, romantic, restorative struggles, utopian, conservative, and reactionary. It's like everything that is negative that can be labeled to you. In the history of communist parties, it can also mean bloody purges when you are branded as something as a populist. Now, right-wing populism and agrarian movements, there are some awkward and at times troubling parallelism, resemblances, and interconnections in their brands of populism. And part of that is the very nature of populism. It can be anything, from right-wing to left-wing. But their parallelism today and possible interconnection are not a random accident. The same condition in political economy gave rise to the rise of both and different types of populism. The boundaries between them are porous, blurring, and malleable. Think about some of the best and brightest kind of left-wing populists in the United States working in food sovereignty. And the rural America who voted Trump. So you will immediately see overlapping, porous, malleable boundaries between them. That kind of thing. That means there's also a slippery slope for populism, progressive, agrarian, and food sovereignty movements to reinforce rather than undermine right-wing populism, even if unintentionally. This very famous and very exciting kind of zero-budget farming technique in India, which is becoming very popular, and much of Via Campesina base in India, for instance, are also very much into it. Well, Modi and some of the right-wing Hindu nationalists are very much into it too. So you have this awkward kind of overlapping and porous boundary between the two. How do you extricate these two from each other? However, the parallelism, resemblances, interconnections, the boundaries that are porous, blurring, and malleable between these two types of populism put agrarian movements in a potentially strategic location to contribute to building a reformulated notion of and political project around left-wing populism that could subvert right-wing populism on the one side and struggle against consensus at the center on the other side. The complication today is that it's not enough to struggle just against right-wing populism. I think it's always important to have a double spearhead, always also to struggle against the forces that wanted us to believe that sitting in the middle will resolve all the problems in the world. But actually, on many occasions, it exacerbated some of the problems that we have today. Now, with my last 5-10 minutes, where do we stand and what can we do as academic researchers? Well, there are multiple ways of doing this. Evidence engagement, policy, ways of oriented ways of doing research. And one of which is scholar activism. It's just a very small part of it because there are many scholars who have nothing to do with activism, but do brilliant and very useful and powerful research anyway. And they are great, and they are much more numerous. But today I just wanted to talk about a very small community and a very small kind of tradition of doing on how to do research, and it's a scholar, scholar activism or activist scholarship. By scholar activists, I mean those who explicitly aim to interpret the world in various ways, but also to aim to change it, and change it towards greater social justice. It's a commitment to social change towards greater social justice. But not only that, they are also the ones who are connected unapologetically to political projects or social justice movements. How do we work as scholars in the context of social justice? Francis Fox Piven, a great sociologist from CUNY in New York, summarizes this in a piece I think published in Antipode. And I just wanted to read this quickly here because it summarizes the whole spirit of doing things differently in research. She said, when we commit ourselves to the more troubling sorts of demands that advance the interests and ideas of groups that are at the margins of public life, the people who are voiceless, degraded, and exploited, when we commit ourselves to the often disorderly movements, that's her own kind of emphasis, disorderly movements that try to advance the political causes of these groups, when we join our critiques of the institutional arrangements that the movements are trying to change, to commitment to the movement itself, it is this sort of divided commitment between an academic career and dissident activism that provokes reflection on how to do both. And it's not easy, as I'm sure most of you would know. Part of the awkwardness and difficulty of doing both is that an activist, or at least a good activist based on Saul Alinsky's definition of a good activist, is someone who is irreverent, subversive, and passionate. Well, think about if you would be irreverent, subversive, and passionate inside the academic communities, what will happen to you? A good academic, in turn, is prim, respectful, and clinical. It's almost kind of opposite kind of features of both. It's the contradictory qualities that define scholar activists, but also generate a lot of tension and contradiction in doing that. But more practically, it goes down to the different ways in which the activist world and the academic world would look at two things very important to both. One is the question of rigor and the question of impact. Rigor for us academics, rigor, it means a publication that has gone through a proper peer review. That means the higher and more prestigious the journals you publish in, it is assumed that the higher and more rigorous the peer review process has been. Or submitting to hotshot kind of granting institutions that we know that minimally probably there would be 5 peer reviewers who would say whether you can get 3 million euros for your ESC grant or not, and so on and so forth. Rigor is very much linked to peer review process in that academic sense. Impact for academic world is measured in different ways, but nowadays they're becoming much more straightforward, sophisticated, although very controversial. Impact, H index. So the question, what's your H index? Which journal did you publish? And then they would ask you what's the impact factor of the journals in which your articles appeared? How many full text downloads you got? So researchers, all of us are being hassled by the powers that be in our institutions to deliver the points that they needed for accreditation, for their subsidies and everything. And that's part of impact. Nowadays in the Netherlands, they introduced one part, it's called societal impact. We are asked to list, did you go to a workers' strike, a barricade? Check, you also have a point. This is great. The Dutch are also very innovative in a lot of ways. So it's like, some points here and there. I would be attending a meeting of Via Campesina. I also earn a point for doing that finally, kind of thing. Rigor and impact is a different word in the academia, but it influences the way we think about what kind of research we do, how do we do it, and where do we get the money. We don't think about rigor and impact after the fact of our research. Normally these days we think about them before thinking about research. We do research now that we know that when we publish from those research, it would deliver all this required rigor and impact that we need. So it actually politicizes and frames the way we think about knowledge generation. They are not politically innocent and random things, partly because of that. Well, the activist world has a very different way, ideas of looking at rigor and impact. Rigor, something like, did you consult the communities about your research? Did you come back and discuss about how you framed your question and how you were thinking about the emerging answers to these questions? Did you have a feedback gathering with the communities or with the movement leaders and members about your research? That's also their brand of peer review, which can be very disconcerting and unsettling for many academic researchers in a way, because they would ask many different things that sometimes makes us uncomfortable or are not very relevant to us. Impact is even more problematic for many of us. Impact for them is like, why? Did your publication stop the dam construction? Like, what? But impact for them is something that much more palpable. It's a very different ways of doing things. So these things, I think, are continuously being negotiated in a very tension-filled kind of relationship between academics and activists. The problem there is that if you are a scholar-activist or activist-scholar, you internalize both. You have this dual persona in yourself. So it's like you're going loco or crazy, playing two personalities in your brain, in your heart. And that's part of the difficulty of doing these things. But I think it's also part of the challenge and the beauty of doing this thing. And especially in the theme of this conference, we put justice. I think doing things, the way how we do it should be just. For something that we aim, that will also be just. And I think a activist-scholar way of doing things is one way that could actually bring us much more closer to that kind of way of doing things that have something to do with justice. In conclusion, I think I'm going to do a Finnish way of finishing. Broader political context for our sectoral researchers have been altered. Among others, we have the rise of right-wing populism. It's impossible to dismiss them. They are just, in an unprecedented way, nearly global. So talk about policies and politics, it's just impossible to ignore them. The question is, how do we do research and policy advocacy in this kind of context? It's difficult but necessary to ask big and act insurgent around 5 hours. But the problem, our dilemmas, anything short of this will only result in more of the same, and poor people are getting tired and sick of long and multiple cycles of broken promises. A reformulated left-wing populism as countercurrent to right-wing populism? Maybe. I don't know. What does it mean? How does it look like? I don't know. Probably part of the things that we need to all think about. Especially in the context of scholar-activist and activist-scholar kind of tradition, which means much more complicated and difficult ways of doing research, but it can be complementary to other approaches and can be quite rewarding academically and politically. Thank you very much.